Hello my friends and welcome to the Lulu Blue Studio channel. My name is Luisa and today we are going to paint this composition. Have you ever wondered where to place your main flowers and leaves and how to add layers? Well, today we are going to dive into the composition rules and the layering effect. Are you ready? Let's start! The first thing I do when I start to paint is to create on my color palette a light color value of the color I want my main flowers to be. In this case, a mixture of pink, magenta and a little bit of red, Scarlet Lake. I usually start painting the biggest flowers, so the main flowers that you find on the painting. I usually start, depending on the flower, from the inner petals or the outer petals, and I use usually a light wash of the colors I want my flowers to be. In this case, I'm starting to paint a flower that can be a peony, and then I start to create the inner petals and the petals that define the crown all around. As you can see, the wash is very light. That means that the color value of this pink is very light. It means that there is a high amount of water and a little amount of color. Don't worry, we are going to add colors, adding layers and adding more strokes through the wet and wet technique. In this first step, we are still adding additional brush strokes that resemble the petals, the outer petals of this peony. I'm using a filbert brush and in particular the belly and the side of the filbert brush to create these loose style petals. If you don't have a filbert brush, I recommend you to use a round brush. It will do the same kind of job. At this point, I mix into my very light mixture of pink, a little bit of blue, this is cobalt blue, and with this brush, with this filbert brush, I started to add a few brush strokes of blue. Basically, I am trying to add a few contrast strokes, adding a color that is a little bit darker compared to the pink that represents the color of the base of this first peony. While the first layer is still wet, I'm adding through the wet on wet technique some brush strokes of more concentrated color, a little bit of magenta and a few brush strokes of Scarlet Lake. When I have the feeling that the brush strokes are a little bit too concentrated, I remove part of the pigment in the cup of water and I add to the painting a little bit of water, a little bit of brush strokes that contain less pigment and more water. I am trying to define with this red, with this Scarlet Lake, the petals of this peony. And I'm keeping everything quite loose, so I don't have to be too precise in defining all of these petals. This is just the first layer, and as soon as I am happy with the definition of the first peony, so this is the biggest peony and I place it quite at the center of this page, I started to create another flower on the top area of the page where there is a corner, the top corner, that is still empty. I add this second flower in the upper corner because I wanted to create with all of my flowers in this composition a sort of S shape. This means that the flowers are going to position, for example, in the upper right corner of the page, and then they follow a sort of S shape where basically the eyes of the observer are going to look at the composition starting from the top and going down, following an S shape, to the bottom. To create this second flower, I'm following the same process, so I'm using just a very light valued color to create the first layer, mainly in pink color. I'm going to create these peonies, these flowers in very similar colors, where here and there I'm going to add a few touches, a few brush strokes of cobalt blue to let some of the petals pop and to create a better definitions of these flowers. With the first layer, I just define the shape of the flower, and I have a better understanding of where I wanted to add more contrasting strokes to let some areas of the flower pop. For example, I usually like to let the center of the flowers having a darker color in order to call the eye of the observer. And so the way I approach my compositions, my flower composition, is to create first the main flowers and try to place the flowers in a sort of S shape on the paper, where the eyes of the observer can follow this S shape from the top of the page down to the bottom of the page. In this case, for example, I'm adding this small bud in the upper left corner of the page. This bud is not as high as the second flower I've created because I wanted the second flower to be the first flower that the observer looks at, and that follows then the S shape of the small bud down to the main peony that I've created in first place. I've noticed that there is some white space and I wanted to add some additional colors, especially on the right and on the left side of the paper. Therefore, I've decided to add in yellow a few brush strokes that resemble some round and small flowers that fall from the center where these big pink flowers meet down to the bottom of the page. As you can see, I'm using a shape for these yellow flowers that is completely different from the shape of the strokes of the main flowers in pink. This because I wanted to create a little bit of contrast. To create these yellow flowers, I'm also using the same technique of adding a first layer of light value yellow, and then I keep adding other brush strokes on top through the wet on wet technique to start to build on volume. I do the same thing on the left side of the paper because I noticed that there is some white space and I want a little bit of symmetry between these yellow flowers. I am following the rule of the odd numbers for the main flowers in pink color, that are the main flowers that catch the attention of the observer, and usually these are in odd number 3 or 5 flowers. And now I'm using a couple of flowers, the yellow flowers, left and right, to create a little bit more symmetry in this composition. I take a small round brush in size 6 to start adding a little bit more details onto the yellow flowers first. This because I love how the green blends into the yellow, and while the yellow of the first layer of these yellow flowers is still wet, I wanted to add this sort of stems that will blend perfectly together. So I've created these flowers leaving a little bit of white space in between, and now I'm adding the green center. If you don't like how the green blends into the yellow, you can wait for this step until the end when the yellow is completely dry. I do not add a lot of pressure to create these stems, but I just keep my hand very, very light and I use the tip of this brush to create these fine brush strokes. I add the same stems also to the bud, and then I use a bigger brush, a round brush in size 12, to start adding more leaves. For the leaves, I proceed in the same way. I started to create the first, let's say, set of leaves using a quite bright sort of green. This is a mixture mainly of sub-green with the green that I have on my palette, and I started to create these first leaves. In a second moment, I will add definition to these leaves, adding different layers and different brush strokes with also a smaller brush to create more definition and more movement. In this moment, while I'm creating the first layer for these leaves, I'm just using the tip and the belly of my brush to start creating these loose style leaves. Regarding the composition, I noticed that the lower right corner of the page is still quite empty, and therefore I decided to start to add the leaves exactly in this area. So as I said, I first started to build leaves with a very loose style using this round brush, so using the belly and the tip of the brush, and then while this first layer is still wet, I add a few brush strokes in darker green or more concentrated sub-green. When the lower corner of this page is complete and is quite filled with leaves, I proceed creating other leaves where I notice that there are some white spaces in the upper part of the page, and then I will create other leaves in the lower part of the page. With these leaves in the lower corner, in the right side of the page, I keep creating this S shape where the eyes of the observers are led to look at the painting. I then add a few leaves also in the left lower corner of the page because I noticed that this area is quite empty, and also because I wanted to create a little bit of symmetry between the leaves at the bottom part of the page. Still, I keep the leaves in the lower right side of the page much heavy in volume and in weight, because I want the eyes of the observer, as I said before, to follow an S shape and look at the whole composition. I don't want the eyes of the observer to stop just in one place, for example, where the main big flower is. I create a high volume of leaves using this technique of just touching the paper with a little bit of pressure of this round brush. And I do this keeping in mind every time to change as much as possible the color value and the color hue for these leaves. I change the color value, removing part of the pigment in the cup of water, and I change the color hue by adding to these greens different colors. Sometimes I can add a little bit of blue, sometimes I can add a little bit of red or magenta, and I create different sort of greens that can match together once onto the page. While I created all the leaves, the first layer of these main flowers started to dry. And so now I'm ready to use the round brush to start to create another layer on top of the first one, on the petals. I usually start to build the layers using similar colors that I have on the base, so on the first layer, and in this case I mixed a little bit of magenta and a little bit of cobalt blue. With the side and the tip of the round brush, I started to create these sort of patches where I want to define the petals of these flowers. While this second layer is still wet, I like to add usually some bright accent colors that can blend while the second layer is still wet. In this case, I've added these red brush strokes into the purple that is still wet. There is no right and no wrong where to add these second brush strokes, these second layers, and I think it comes down to experience and practice. Where I have added a little bit of brush strokes in red color, I like to add a few brush strokes in dark purple that is a mixture of magenta and cobalt blue. I like to add with the very tip of this brush on some corners where the second layer is still wet, and I like to see how these different colors, for example red and purple, are blending together. I let them basically blend directly onto the paper instead of creating a mixture on the color palette and then laying this mixture on the petals. Remember to add these layers with different brush strokes in different sizes. Some brush strokes can be quite thick, while it's nice to have other brush strokes that are thinner and even shorter in size. I adopt this layering technique also to the second flower that I'm creating in the upper corner of the page. In this case, this flower seems to be a little bit towards the blue color. Therefore, I add a few brush strokes that contain a higher amount of cobalt blue compared to magenta. If you have the impression that sometimes this second layer is too concentrated or too dark, don't worry. You can always remove part of the pigment from your brush into the cup of water, and just using a higher amount of water from the brush, you can go back to these dark patches and just refine and create a very translucent layer. You can add as many layers and as many brush strokes as a second layer as you want. You can also create less layers compared to what I've done, and I encourage you in general to test and to try and find your style through this layering technique. Also keep in mind that you can decide to add a second and even further layers onto your flowers, but you don't have to apply this technique to all the flowers in the same composition. You might decide to add a few layers on the main flowers and maybe leave the secondary flowers as simple as they look to be, just having a one layer. With the fine tip of your round brush, you can highlight, for example, with the fine brush strokes, the shape of your petals. Take some time to understand where to add these brush strokes and enjoy this process. I really think that adding layers is one of the best practices to enjoy watercolor painting. And at this point, I decided to add a second layer also onto the yellow secondary flowers. And since these flowers are a little bit smaller in size, I just take a smaller brush, this is a round brush in size 6, and I add as a second layer a few brush strokes of a mixture of yellow ochre and yellow lemon dip. As I said, this second layer doesn't have to be added to all the flowers of each and every composition you create, but I just thought in this case I didn't want these yellow flowers to be lost because I've created a lot of leaves and these pink flowers are quite big, so I've decided to add a second layer also onto these yellow flowers. I now keep using the same brush to add a few brush strokes onto the leaves. In this way, I'm trying to give a little bit more definitions to these loose style leaves, adding a few brush strokes in very dark color. I'm using a mixture mainly of sap green with a little bit of magenta. This creates a more muted but still quite intense sort of dark green. And I'm using magenta because magenta is the color I've used for the main flowers. Therefore, this green will shorten the gap between the brightness of the sap green and the red of the flowers. Using different sizes of brushes to create these leaves allow me to create leaves in different styles and in different sizes, and therefore to have an overall movement all over the page. So one of the main takeaways of this video is to remember to place your flowers in a sort of S shape all over the page. You can start creating the main flowers first and then adding secondary flowers following this shape in order for the observer to look from the top of the page until the bottom of the page. Start to add additional layers when the first layer is completely dry. And you can achieve this using a round brush in different sizes, considering the size of these layers you want to create. Remember, you can add through the wet on wet technique onto the first, but also on additional layers, more bleeding effects that are going to be beautiful in the moment the painting is going to be completely dry. Remember to use different colors and to add a few brush strokes onto the leaves and onto the petals that are in different colors in order to create movements. For example, remember to create different leaves in very dark colors that are going to clash with lighter leaves you might have created in first place. At this point, we are adding the center of the flowers just by touching with the tip of the brush the center that we have left empty in these flowers and creating some fine lines and a few dots. To give more dimension to these yellow centers, I also add a little bit of brown, burnt umber, to give a little bit more contrast. Contrast in watercolor painting is key. Therefore, as we have done for the petals and as we have done also for the leaves, remember adding some contrasting brush strokes also into the center of your flowers. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If so, subscribe to this channel and let me know what you would like to see next. Bye!